Good evening, everybody. I hope that you still have energy left for this final big session of the day, and the day what has been really, for me, has been splendid and full of really new ideas and fruitful discussion. And before we go in there, I have a small practical announcement, and it is concerning the tests. It means that by now you have expired the time what is necessary for PCR test. So when you still need a test, and I think that it mostly concerns people who have flights to US, then the antigen test is the option for you. We double-checked what was told to us at the moment is that antigen test is acceptable on US flights, on overseas flights. It will be valid for 24 hours. You will get result in 30 minutes directly on your mailbox. If you need to book a time for the antigen test, then the easiest way to do it is to go in airport, so just reserve additional 40 minutes and go earlier to the airport. If on some reason it is not going to work for you, then please just come to us and we think something out. We will find a solution, but I just stress that it is the easiest way. So I hope that everything will work fine, that you all will get back safely and without any complications. And with this, I give the word over to Tara, and happy and fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Eva. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm very happy to be with my distinguished panel, not only because China was mentioned in almost every panel I attended today. We are seeing and experiencing increasing pressure from China and competition on all grounds: diplomatic, economic, technologic. Xi Jinping is also getting closer every day to his objective, which is for China to be independent from the world, all the while making the world more dependent on China. The new US administration is focusing most of its efforts and energy on defining its policy towards China and towards the Chinese challenge, they would say, and trying to get partners and allies on board. US-China tensions are all-encompassing, but we see specific competition over key enabling technologies. For the EU, the main challenge is to reconcile how a government we deem to be a systemic rival in March 2019 can at the same time be a strategic partner. China is now inside Europe. It practices pick and choose in its relations with the EU. It often ignores EU norms and doesn't hesitate to let its wrath known if a country deviates from the party line. Estonia's neighbor, Lithuania, is facing quite a ferocious and violent response from Beijing, as it announced a few weeks ago that it was going to open a Taiwanese representative office was going to open in Vilnius. How the EU responds to this will be a test for its credibility. But for now, I will start and turn to Dean for a presentation on US-China tensions and specifically on technology.
Well, good evening, and allow me to begin by expressing my appreciation to ICDS for the opportunity to be here this evening. My comments are going to try and place US-China tensions both in context and to provide some additional focus on the technological aspect. To begin with, I think it's very important to recognize that US-Chinese tensions did not begin under Xi Jinping. They did not begin with Donald Trump. They date back at a minimum to the 2008-2009 period, when we saw the Chinese begin to expand much more into the South China Sea, begin to increase tension with US forces in the Western Pacific, but also take an ever more assertive stance towards a variety of territorial issues and towards its political neighbors. The technological aspect of all of this is rooted, I would suggest, in the CCP's view of living in what they term the information age. From the CCP's perspective, we now live in the information age. We have transitioned out of the industrial age. What that means is that the fundamental currency of international power, in their view, has shifted. And now it rests upon, whereas in the industrial age, it was a matter of how much merchant shipping did you produce? How many tons of bauxite did you smelt? Now it is how much information do you generate? Do you transmit? Do you analyze, which is a human, not a technological aspect? And how much can you exploit? This focus on technology is for the CCP, in part, a lesson derived from the century of humiliation, the period between 1839 and 1949 when China was at its weakest, in part because imperial China had failed to recognize both the shift in the world to the industrial age and the important role of technology. And in a very real sense, Xi Jinping's China dream of the great revival of the Chinese people rests upon China's ability to be an active generator as well as producer of technology. And this in turn ties to the Chinese concept of comprehensive national power, which is how they measure and compare China with nations as varied as Bolivia, Germany, Estonia, Thailand, and of course the United States. Comprehensive national power encompasses not just military and economic capability, but diplomatic respect, political unity, science and technology, and even cultural security. But technology plays a role in every one of these pieces. When we look at US-China tensions in this regard, the tendency has been to focus upon high technology. Military technology is a natural piece of this. The US and China compete in space technology, increasingly in stealth technology. Information and communications technology is another realm in which there is very clearly competition. In particular, the Chinese talk about ABC, artificial intelligence, big data, cloud computing, and also quantum computing. And in each of these areas, it is not so clear how much longer China is going to be dependent upon IP theft, because China increasingly is in the very first ranks of these key technology areas, particularly artificial intelligence / machine learning, but also quantum computing. But I want to emphasize here that China is not only competing in advanced high technology or those areas that have military application. When we look at Made in China 2025, it is very clear. Made in China 2025 says China wants to be independent in 10 key technology areas. And it is very clear when we look at these technology areas that they are not only in high technology. For example, it includes railroads. And I don't mean bullet trains. I mean basic locomotives, old-fashioned heavy steel and aluminum. But that moves material, that moves equipment. Ocean transport, agricultural machinery, very dull, very boring, very essential for building the foundation of an economy. Also, it is important to recognize that technology is not just about technology. It is also about industrial standards. And China has promulgated China Standards 2035. And this is an attempt to ensure that Chinese products can never be excluded from a market because it fails to meet standards, while at the same time imposing Chinese standards on global technology development. For example, in cybersecurity, in information security on your smartphone, China has managed to ensure that Apple does not use the highest level security, but uses a security standard that is inferior, but which China would prefer. I will leave it to your imagination as to why China might prefer a less capable capacity. What this really goes to is that we face comprehensive competition, not only between the United States and China, but between China and the rest of the world. Not just the Western world, but the entire world. Because China recognizes that technology is not just about the high end, although the high end is important, but it's about the broad range. And that technology in turn touches on so many other pieces. I would suggest, for example, because you know that Afghanistan will eventually come up in even this panel, that one of the key markers is going to be, for the Chinese, how many countries quietly reverse their position on Huawei in the future? How many countries are going to be told by the Chinese, the Americans are not reliable? Now, that's a defense issue. But angering me, China, by prohibiting me from entering your 5G networks when I produce perfectly good equipment that is inexpensive, well, that's a poor choice on your part. And how persuasive will that be? Let me conclude. China is practicing, in the words of the president at the dinner the other night, a challenge to the global posture. And while her comments focus more on the values end, talk about human rights, I would suggest that this also applies at a more technological/trade level, that what we are seeing is the emergence of a new technological mercantilism. That we see a China that believes in informational mercantilism. It has a right to your information and to access your information networks, but you do not have a right to penetrate the Great Firewall of China. And supply chain mercantilism. As Tara said, China should be part of your supply chains, whether you are making cell phones or agricultural machinery, railroads, or quantum computing. But you have no role in their informational environment. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you so much. François, you've written about the era of predators. So can you tell us whether China is a predator? And if so, what are the hunting grounds of this modern predation?
Short answer is yes. The longer answer, well, first of all, technology is vitally important, and I agree with everything that Dean Cheng said on this score. But the problem of China is not at heart a technological problem. The problem of China is that it is a totalitarian system which has its own values, its own mode of governance, and which has an ideology very much, I wasn't going to say of its own, since it's an ideology which the people in Estonia are well placed or badly placed to have experienced in the not so recent past. This is an idiocracy, and technology is an enabler of this ideological system. The cyber dictatorship, the cyber aggressor, the cyber proponent of a certain form of international order or disorder. This is what we have to take into account. This is what makes China more dangerous than simply having to face a techno-mercantilist challenge. You don't fight a techno-mercantilist challenge with aircraft carriers. You don't need to have a US-Chinese geopolitical standoff if it's only about techno-mercantilism. That's my first point. Second point, and this harkens to something which Carl Bildt said earlier on, we have transverse planetary threats, short-term pandemics, longer-term climate change. It is vitally important, of course, that we meet these challenges together, as he told us. The problem is that in this pandemic, China has not demonstrated any particular willingness to enable us to face this kind of threat. The lack of cooperation by China in providing any serious data on the origins of this pandemic do not bode well for Chinese cooperation on other planetary threats. So this is also something we have to take into account. Now, where does this leave Europe? And this is my main thrust. Some of you, and we talked about this already in the nuclear session that we had over breakfast, so those who were there will forgive me for raising it again. There's a remarkable science fiction novel written by a Chinese person called Yu Qi-qian, which is called The Three-Body Problem. It's an excellent book, I would add. I'm not usually a science fiction fan, but this is really good. And the three-body problem, which exists in physics, is when you have three bodies with a strong gravitational field which intersects, you cannot, apparently, I'm not a mathematician, you cannot predict in advance how those three bodies are going to interact. Mm-hmm. Those three bodies in geopolitics are China, the US, and in a different way, Russia. And in the science fiction novel, as in reality, there is a planet which happens to be caught in this particular conundrum. That planet is Europe. Mm-hmm. We are, in essence, in a field of dependency vis-à-vis these three great powers. Now, they're not identical, neither in terms of values, nor in terms of objectives, nor indeed in terms of intrinsic power. But we depend on what they do. And as for our American friends, and this makes our problem more complicated, our American friends have other priorities than Europe nowadays. It's fairly obvious. Secondly, the energy level, the political energy level of the US is not as high as one would want it to be, given the divided state of the society. And thirdly, those means of power which the United States retains and for which there is no equivalent Chinese power today, which means, in other words, we're not talking about military power, in which China is catching up very quickly. I'm talking about digital power, financial power, monetary power. These are areas in which Europe suffers whenever the United States does something. These are areas in which our interests are not automatically aligned. This is not like NATO, really not like NATO. And this makes the problem for Europe, how to react vis-à-vis China, even more complicated. So I'll conclude 2 points. First, the battle of the standards, which Dean referred to, standards and norms, is tremendously important. The US and the EU have to work together on this. This is what is being planned. This has begun to be done, and this is a good thing. But it'll only work if the European Union manages to work as one, as we have been doing on GDPR, as we can do on other things. This is not a foregone conclusion, and the Americans and the Europeans can come to a compromise, but it will not work if the Europeans go there in disorder and in disarray. Second point, Europe has to decide whether it will or will not work with the United States and in other democracies in a broad front of democracies. This is a very big issue. This is what Biden is going to push us to do. The Europeans, for the time being, have not displayed any particular enthusiasm vis-à-vis this project. I am not going to conclude on what we should do. That we can discuss in the debate, but that's the question which I will leave on the table for us to discuss.
Well, I'm pretty sure that's a question that can be taken over by Ulrike, actually. You're the tech expert here, and you know a lot about the impact of tech on geopolitics and what Europe should do, so you might have an answer for us.
I'll try to give an answer. Yes, exactly. So thanks a lot for having me, and those people in the audience who know me know that I'm not a China expert, and I'm not here as such, but I do work on technology and on European technology, and want to make 3 short points on where Europe fits in this kind of rise in technological power in China and the Sino-American competition on technology. And my first point may be somewhat surprising to some of you, but my first point is that we don't actually know where Europe stands in terms of capabilities in this alleged tech race between the United States and China. And you may say, well, that's odd, because I've read at least 15 articles that say there's a digital divide and, you know, Europe is lacking, is falling behind, and there's this very famous quote from Kai-Fu Lee about Europe not even being in the running for bronze medal on artificial intelligence. And that's, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying, turns out Europe is totally ahead of the US and China and we just don't know it. The point I want to drive home is that there is a really surprising lack of information and lack of data when it comes to what Europe, and I'm really meaning all Europe, so EU 27 or beyond, are able to do and have in terms of tech capability. Because most of these overviews that talk about the digital gap and all of this look at the top 5, right? They look at Germany and at France and at the United Kingdom, but they rarely look at what other European nations are able to do. So there is a lack of data in this field that's quite concerning, actually. Why is that? And that's basically my point 1A and 1B. 1A is that because European governments actually only rather recently, you know, woke up to the fact that this is a thing, and by this I mean tech and geopolitics and tech and security. And there are still countries in Europe that basically are scrambling to put together digital strategies and AI strategies, and only, you know, recently have woken up to this. Some countries have been working on this for a long time. Finland is already at its 2nd AI strategy, just to, you know, kind of give you a sense. But there are differences here. And then 1B, why we have this lack of data and knowledge, is that unfortunately we have very little funding really for research and very little research in this realm in Europe. And I realize that this sounds terribly self-serving, right? You know, the think tanker that says we need more money for funding in my research field. But the fact of the matter is, you know, when you look at the United States, for example, they have, just to take one research organization that has been doing amazing work in this field, the Center for CSET at Georgetown University. Their funding just went up to $100 million to focus on AI and security.
Where does the money come from?
Philanthropic, it's private funding, partly from tech companies and partly from foundations. And I'm, you know, only partly joking if I say, you know, I'm not sure whether we have 10 million euro being invested in this in Europe. So sorry for being self-serving, but this is something that's actually a concern. My second point is that the challenge for Europe in this alleged tech race, or the challenge for Europe on tech and tech regulation, is that we actually need to look both ways. So towards the US and towards China. And that comes with a certain set of challenges. Because for the US, it's relatively easy. The US is totally focused on China. I mean, tech and AI in particular has become central to the geopolitical competition between the US and China. And it's actually almost funny. You may have seen that the US National Security Committee Commission on AI recently published a 700+ report on, you know, AI and security, national security in the US. And on these 700 pages, China was mentioned 699 times. Russia was mentioned 64 times. Europe was in the low 60s. So, you know, I think the focus here is very clear. And in China, I think it's somewhat similar. It may not be quite so extreme, but we heard about China, Made in China 2025, about the goal of overtaking the West and the US. Many have spoken about the Sputnik moment for Chinese tech research, when the AlphaGo computer beat the reigning champion in Go a while back. So I think, you know, for these two countries, it's relatively clear. But for Europe, it's much more tricky because, yes, of course, geopolitically speaking, China in this equation is the competitor, and we've heard about China being a systemic rival now and all of this. But technologically speaking, well, it's actually that in Europe, the GAFA are dominating, right? Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. And the worry in Brussels is more about Google lobbying the European Commission or lacking data privacy standards at Facebook, more than about Chinese firms and about Chinese actions. Not that this is completely overlooked, but it isn't the focus. And so I would argue that for Europe, very often, The other really is US and US companies. And I must admit that, while geopolitically there's of course no question that Europe should side with the US, I think it is more than legitimate to also worry about, surveillance capitalism from US companies or even surveillance from the NSA. And my third point, and I'll keep this short, is that also something to note is that for Europe, working with the US on tech isn't actually so easy. Just to point out a few elements, again, it seems obvious that given the geopolitical situation of the world and given that this geopolitical competition between the US and China is being played on the technological stage, we should, do everything to work with the US and make sure that we create this common front that the US wants us to create. But there are certain things that make this a bit harder. I mean, number one, I think the fact that we are in a competition with China is just less clear in Europe than it is the US. You can deplore this fact, but I think that is a fact. Secondly, it feels very much as if the US is reaching out to Europe on technology primarily, if not only, in order to counter China. And so there's an element of like, do you really want to work with us, or are you doing this only to counter China? But maybe more importantly, I think there are some real differences between the US and the European approach on technology. I think data privacy is kind of the most important one here, but there may be others. And then maybe most importantly, and this is a very tricky one, it may not always be in Europe's interest to work with the US. And I just pick one example. You may know that Europe, the EU, has kind of chosen trustworthy AI, trustworthy artificial intelligence, as like the one thing it wants to create. And on the one hand, you could say, working with the US on this makes a lot of sense because the more people we have on board, especially dominating players such as the US, the more widely we will have trustworthy AI, and this is going to be good for everyone. And that's true to some extent. But the other side of the coin is that trustworthy AI and this focus on privacy, etc., in Europe could and should eventually become a location advantage for Europe, a kind of selling point for European AI. And so there is a question, there is a legitimate interest question of, is this something that we want to share, if you like, and really work with the US, or do we want to keep this for ourselves? So what should we do? Final point. I think the messages I really want to bring across is that Europe needs to think about tech and tech competition and tech regulation more, and it needs to go beyond the US-China competition. Most importantly, I think Europe should really try to focus on questions that if we don't work on them, no one else will do it for us. And for example, one of those would be the impact of technological advances, particularly in the military realm, for smaller states. I think there are actually really tremendous opportunities to be found here, but barely anyone has looked into this because the US isn't looking into this. They're not a small state. China is not going to look into this. So this is something that Europeans need to do, and we should do this. And yes, don't get me wrong, I spend a lot of time saying why working with the US is tricky. Of course, Europe should be working with the US in this field, but that discussion won't be easy. So what I want is that Europe goes into this discussion better prepared than it is now. Thank you.
Thank you. Samir, let me turn to you. We've heard from Europeans and Americans. India shares a border with China. It has had to face military incursions from China, and it decided earlier this year to ban close to 60 Chinese apps because it declared that they infringed on India's sovereignty and integrity. What is your point of view on how we need to deal with competition from China on tech and others?
I think the previous interventions were really enlightening. I think there were three important elements that I could discern from all of the presentations till now. The first, of course, was that it's not a techno-mercantilist project or a technology project. I think it's an ideological project. And let me try and unclutter this further. I was in a conversation with one of India's finest minds on China, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, the former foreign secretary. And he said something that really struck me. He said that we have always said Pakistan is an army that has a state. In China, the Communist Party has a state as well. So I think if you start understanding the political ideological framework within which all instruments are propagated, used, deployed, nurtured, invested into and created, you will start seeing that there is only one single purpose of China tech: furtherance of the agenda, ideology, views and worldviews of the Communist Party of China. So this is not a technology project, this is a CPP project as it moves to its 100 years. And I think this is the 100 years of the rejuvenation of the great nation. Emperor Xi is going to use the information age to recast, restructure, and rewrite every assumption that Europe has allowed itself to prosper with. Every assumption. Nothing that you hold dear to you is going to be untouched. Their project is comprehensive. And I think one thing that we have missed out in this China tech debate, which I want to really bring in, that China tech is actually about changing the social contract. How we view the state, how we view corporations, how we view each other. They are weaponizing and gaming our democracy, our public sphere, and our open systems. Chinese diplomats come and use Twitter and Facebook and other Western mediums. I mean, just imagine that if the Chinese were to kick your French diplomat out of Beijing, you would ask his diplomat to leave too. But in the information era, they come to Twitter and engage with your debates and do not allow you reciprocity and engage with their public sphere. Imagine this, that in the age of information public diplomacy, China is the only one with ambassadors. None of you have the ambassadors to inform their public debates anymore. It is a lopsided public conversation that is happening here. They are gaming us. Now, what does it mean for India? I'll tell you a very simple, small tactical incident, but you can understand the broad implications of it. Some years ago, I went to one of our very senior folks in government and said, let's go to the US. We have to do the next round of the track 1.5. We were hosting on India-US digital partnership. He said, I can't come. Because we are now seeing that every Android phone, and 50% of Android phones in India have the Chinese operating systems. The search there only gives the Chinese view on what's happening on Doklam. I'm talking about the Doklam incident. I've written about it in my book. They have gamed our public sphere to tell Indians what the Indian position on certain issues is. So the Chinese view is the Indian view on many aspects. And I think that worries me more. I mean, just imagine, we had this big Pegasus controversy, right? Now imagine true, not true, false, real. What if deep fakes were to be released, videos, audios were to be released by certain actors, maybe the Chinese, in 3 months' time? You all have now agreed that there was an incident of surveillance, and they will now release the tapes, which perhaps never existed, which perhaps existed in different formats, which perhaps were benign and non-newsworthy. Imagine the interference in our information lives that the Chinese have, and you have no ability to respond to that. And I think that's the first. There is an imbalance. The only ambassadors, and you call them wolf warriors, you call them master statesmen, whatever you want to call them. But I think there is certainly an imbalance that we need to think about, and technology is the tool that is being used to create and further and propagate this imbalance. That's the first point. Second.
You think, sorry, this asymmetry is worse than the economic asymmetry?
Absolutely. I mean, economics, politics follows. It all flows from what we view the world. I mean, you know, there's famous saying that where you stand is how you look at the world. Now, if the Chinese decide where I'm standing, I will see the world in a certain way. I will look at my economic interests, my political interests, my partnerships, all in a certain way. And I think it is extremely dangerous for us to allow our public sphere to be gamed the way it has been gamed over the last decade. And I think that's really dangerous. That's the first point. The second, I come to my friends in US. Sorry, luckily I've not been going to them recently. They don't want us there. But and I share your pain. I share your pain. But if you talk to the Americans, India has to go green. Green transitions, climate change. India is ground zero. India is biggest respondent. Go to Europe. Green, green, green. You know, when you tell me to go green, you tell me to go Beijing. My all green requirements has only one shop. The super, what is it called? The Sam's Club. The Sam's Club of green commodities is marketed and sold and manufactured and produced and controlled by one actor in the world. You tell me to go digital, I have to go to Beijing again. What are we talking about? I mean, sitting in India, you tell me to go digital, you tell me to go green, you tell me don't go to Beijing. Now, this is something that we need to respond to. We cannot be in a world where our most important century objectives, what is the objective of the century, has Emperor Xi's gate pass requirements. And I think this is, again, something that we need to start thinking. And by the way, green is all tech as well. I'm talking about innovation and high tech, and I'm talking about PV and solar and refineries and rare earth and minerals and producing the whole value chain around it. And today, if I have to do this, Emperor Xi. So this is the second problem, that our development planetary objectives today have a requirement for us to go to the court. And we should not be going to anyone's court. Final point, and this is important. The Chinese and Xi Jinping himself, and by the way, this is not Xi Jinping alone, it's also I think Deng Xiaoping also did this when he was going through his troubled period in the late 70s, early 80s. Even he asked folks to go and propagate the Chinese view. His stated objective, and I don't know the Chinese phrase because I don't speak Chinese, I just suffer them. But the idea was to borrow the boat to cross the river. He has borrowed all our boats. He games our universities, he games our media systems, he games our technology companies. He gets you to write his research papers. He has, with little incremental capital, Harvard University gets billions of dollars of endowment. For $25 million Chinese money, you have a whole cohort of academics there who are singing the emperor's tunes. Incremental. He's just giving the cream. Not the main course, not the first course, not the second course, just the mint, after mints. And I think he has borrowed too many boats, and technology is a domain where the boats can be nimble, fast, and before we can respond, he would have already created fait accompli. Fait accompli was not what happened in the Himalayas. Fait accompli is what is happening in technology. We are all being given a fait accompli. Accept this Chinese world and sign on to the emperor's project. And I think we all need to wake up.
What is the alternative?
I think Europe has a role, and regulation is not the answer. So I mean, I know that's a good research project, and I know it's a good way to get funding, but I think Europe has to get out of this regulation and bureaucracy mode. It has to be a political actor. You know, politics. Think about politics. Think about protecting interests. It is no longer values. There is no values. Get interests right first, then we'll go to values. You know, I come to Europe and I have a value nausea. So I think it is time that the middle folks, like Europe, like India, we work together. We understand that what we are really, Europe has to understand we are the front line. The experiment is happening here. But guess what? The $3 trillion Indian economy does not excite the emperor. He wants a $20 trillion market in EU. And you know, when people tell me what is the future of the transatlantic relationship, I don't want it to be a conversation between Beijing and DC. I want Europe to still have a voice in that transatlantic relationship. And I think that is the challenge. That can we move fast enough without waiting for agreeing to a values framework? There is no values framework. There is China and there is a Chinese proposition. If we can disagree with that, respond to it, and then later decide what we want to agree with. So I think an interest-based framework, which is nimble, which is agile, which doesn't want all 200 nations of the United Nations to sign on to it, should be perhaps the first thing we need to do. I like that idea of that AI group of 10. I like these. I like the quote, by the way, Dean. So well done. Heritage has been, promoting that for a long time. I think these nimble coalitions. The multilateralism is never going. The golden age of multilateralism is behind us. Now we are entering the dark age of plurilateralism. We will have to create coalitions of convenience, coalitions of coincidence, and sometimes coalitions because we disagree with someone else. And I think China allows all three of them to play out at the same time. And I think these coalitions are important. I come to Europe and we are still thinking about how can we engage with China? They are a strategic threat. You don't engage with your strategic threat.
But do private...
I still hear this.
Samir, do private companies agree? Because it's one thing as a think tanker to say this, but in tech, I mean, the industry is really important. They can decide that their interests are not aligned with those of
I
their
totally
governments.
agree. When I say borrow the boat, the first boat they borrowed was your private sector. You are so intent in selling your Mercedes-Benz that you will get them to rule your kingdom. They have borrowed that boat as well. And I think it is time that this, public policy folks, political leaders, the Prime Minister would know, had two options, incentives or sticks. Europe decided to throw the stick, and they keep giving incentives to the private sector. It is now time to use the stick. You have two carrots and stick policy, get into the stick mode now. I think you have to draw red lines. You have to create certain boundaries. Sorry, I'm being a little...
No, sorry. François, you wanted to...
Yeah, first of all, as you have noted, Samir and myself are saying pretty much the same thing about the nature of the Chinese project. And I would simply make a note, and that is China, I think, is the only country in the world which does not have a national army. This may surprise many people. It does not have a national army. The People's Liberation Army depends on the party. It serves the party. The Ministry of National Defense is zero in China. There is a Minister of Defense because you need to have protocol occasions, but it really is for protocol occasions. This didn't really matter when China was not a superpower. These things do matter now. Second point on Europe. First of all, Europe alone has managed to impose certain norms. Mm-hmm. We are not actually a digital weakling. I agree with what Ulrike said. GSM 30 years ago, mm-hmm. and GDPR mm-hmm. more recently. Mm-hmm. And the American techs were saying, we'll never implement GDPR. Well, one by one, they'll do it because there's no way they can tap the global market if they do not adopt the EU norm. Problem with that is that the EU will lose its normative power if it does not improve its performance in the next generation of digital technology. We will have to play not only defense, which we have been playing belatedly by creating more or less something which looks like the American system of technology control, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US. We're not quite there yet in the European Union, but we're starting to do that. We have to play more offensively. The Americans alone are actually not very good at imposing standards. There are very few areas in which an American standard prevails globally, whether it's in sports, whether it's in electronics, whether it's the one area in which the Americans prevail is still Hollywood movies. But otherwise, norms are not something the Americans are very good at, global norms. We will have to devise the norms together. That's a really, really important. Last, the provocation, and this goes very much in the direction of what Samir was saying. China decided 15 years ago to build a digital, 20 years ago, a digital Great Wall. The Americans thought they would never be able to do so. Bill Clinton is quoted as saying, you can't build a wall around the internet, etc. Ha, ha, ha. Well, ask Facebook how much business they're doing in China or other American companies. Europe has put in place the GDPR. This is the beginning, not of a great wall, but elements of some form of architecture. If China continues with this great asymmetry, where they have the right to consider the world as a place they can conquer, whereas we do not have the right to enter into China, except as a subcontractor, and when you refuse, and when you pretend to be more than a subcontractor in your own line of business, unpleasant things happen. Ask the CEO of Saab Ericsson how difficult it was with the Chinese when the Americans and some Europeans were saying, Well, Ericsson does perfectly good 5G. Why doesn't Europe buy 5G? Well, the Chinese made it very clear that if there was any form of preference at the expense of the Chinese, Ericsson would lose its business, very lucrative subcontractor business in China. This is the story that you've been telling about the boats. You can put it that way.
But Huawei is still banned in Sweden, so maybe Samir.
Well,
No, just very, I think François is absolutely on the mark. I should have mentioned on the regulation part. You know, I think the regulation has to be political. I didn't mean that there's no need for regulation. I think we have to think of the regulatory landscape as a political proposition and not necessarily as a functional proposition. And I think Europe spends too much time on the functional aspects of regulation rather than the strategic output. I think the GDPR, let me tell you, the GDPR, as far as I'm concerned, is the most muscular sovereign policy announced in this century. Let there be no doubt about it. It has made everyone bow down to it. The Indians too, we were complaining, right? Now we want adequacy commitments from Europe. So I think we expect Europe to come up with those muscular regulations which have a strategic impact, not necessarily deciding just the size of the nut and the screw, but actually where the nut and screw is going to be used. And I think that's the deployment of regulation on a political and strategic plane becomes, I think, something Europe can easily do. It is up the field. And guess what? We used to hate the norms words from Europe and the values word. But now if you look at our own connectivity mantra that we give in our neighborhood, we have basically adopted the European formats of values and norms. So we want to be your partners in normfare. Let's become partners in normfare and let's create an architecture where we can actually respond.
Ulrike?
Yeah, the direct reaction to that, because I also took kind of issue with what I initially understood as you saying, you know, kind of Europe should stop this focus on regulation and value and be more political. Because I actually think that now is the perfect moment to focus very much on regulation and values, but you need to see it as a political tool. Regulation is political, values are political. The thing is, Europe, the EU at least, I think this is actually an EU problem because it's so not in our DNA to think geopolitically. The EU is still very much in this mindset of regulation and values because it's good for humankind. And I mean, you know, I like that approach. It's just that it doesn't quite fit with current realities. And it would be good to also think about regulation and values because it's good for us and kind of helps our positioning. And one super short point about GDPR and the more recent efforts by the EU of regulating or kind of curating the world's first rather comprehensive regulation on artificial intelligence. I think this is really going to put the so-called Brussels effect on the spot. Because GDPR, when GDPR was created, no one really was working on data privacy rules. And so there really was an open field for Europe to impose its rules. And it did so well. I mean, personally, I'm a big fan of GDPR. There are a lot of people that kind of criticize many aspects of it, but I think overall it worked rather well in the sense of, you know, we've created something that we thought was right, and it was largely adopted throughout the world, even though the UK is now apparently leaving GDPR rules. So let's make of that what you want. But my point is that, you know, this was the situation with GDPR, and that was already tricky enough. With AI regulation, very different, because everyone wants to be the one to set the norms and standards for AI now. So this is going to be really interesting, whether the fact that the EU came up with this rather comprehensive regulation on AI, whether that's going to give it this big advantage and whether it can kind of repeat the GDPR effect. And the, you know, honestly, the bets are still on. I can't tell you, but I think that's something to think about, because you always say that, oh, we're just going to repeat GDPR. Well, let's see.
Dean,
just a couple of reactions to some of the other comments here. Let me begin by the issue of trustworthy AI. The idea of cooperating with China on the issue of trustworthy AI smacks almost of working with an alligator on vegetarianism.
I don't think anyone really proposes that.
Well, but I mean, the idea of cooperating technologically with the Chinese truly is, and you can see a variety of corporations in the United States that engage in joint ventures with the Chinese, only to find that inevitably their IP evaporated. More to the point, however, is this conversation very rapidly went down the AI, high-tech, ICT path. And perhaps regulation works there. Perhaps GDPR is a wonderful, shining opportunity. One of the things I tend to focus on is China's space program. There aren't that many folks who look at China's space program in Chinese. And one of the responses that we have seen to American actions, which is the rise of commercial space capabilities in the United States, is China's effort to develop a commercial space capability of their own, some of which are simply relabeled state-owned enterprises, but some of which are actually commercial entities, more in the space services sector than in space manufacturing. Where are Europe's commercial space entities? Where, the issue was raised about, is this really a choice between, the American approach and the Chinese approach, and what about all of the things that Europe might be doing that haven't been studied? And coming from another think tank, trust me, I hope you get lots of funding.
You and everyone.
But let me just point out, as far as I know, and I'm a provincial American, I freely admit this, I don't know of too many European computer manufacturers in terms of laptops, or European programs, other than SAP, which is heavily used by people who do databases, and some game designers, which is a multi-billion-dollar business, so that's not derogatory. But in just about every other aspect of the supply chains and other things, where is Europe? Not in terms of has there been a study done on this, but simply your cell phones, your laptops. How many of those are made in Europe? I think that, research is always helpful, but my wife, who does healthcare, jokingly observed that no one's ever done a double-blind study on the utility of parachutes. So there's no control group. So I think that the absence of a European presence in the hardware and software realms, in the area of commercial spaceflight, and in a number of other areas, suggests that while regulation can play a role, and absolutely can be part of the defensive aspect, it is just as likely to wind up choking off opportunities for development. Again, I'm not suggesting that there is no role for regulation, but I think that there are other, more offensive, I think was the phrase used earlier, options. And I would just point, for example, to COCOM. Many of you may well remember the old coordinating committee, where the idea was Russia would offer opportunities to make business, and we as the West would forego those opportunities in coordination with each other, because we recognized that this was much too dangerous.
Correct.
And maybe in addition to a CFIUS for Europe, there needs to be a revival of the COCOM concept so that the companies all recognize not only are we no longer going to loan you the boats, but we recognize that if I am the one who doesn't loan you a boat, but you'll make money off of this. And so, and what that goes to, sorry for the values fatigue, is the fact that there are shared values among us that we do not share with the Chinese.
So this is how we resist weaponized interdependence?
It's a first step.
Sorry, Rika, and then we'll open to...
Yeah, just very briefly on the capabilities, because I don't think that there's anyone in this room or in the EU or anywhere questioning that we need to build up our capabilities in all of these fields. I think this is something, I mean, honestly, this is the first thing that's in all AI strategies that says, we need to do more and we need to invest more. And there are lots of programs doing that. My point about the research is related to that, but slightly different. What I'm saying is that, I get these requests from whatever ministries basically asking, but where should we put our money? What exactly should we build up? What could the European Union really invest in? What would be the most valuable thing for me to do? And this is where I say, well, unfortunately, I can't quite tell you because we haven't really done the mapping. And again, maybe you can just say, okay, clearly we're lacking at everything and we should be building up space capabilities and AI and I don't know what. And if we had the money, that would be my answer. But this is where I think that the lacking data and the lacking research comes in. That it is actually rather tricky to say anything about what Europe might become good at and where niche capabilities may already be, we just don't know. So that's the link. But yes, of course, it's, everyone agrees that you can't just, regulate and not actually have capabilities yourself. And this is where all these statements that I was quoting earlier come from, of the digital gap and falling behind, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it very much looks this way. But in order to address this, I need to know where to do that and how to do that. And I'm not sure whether anyone has great answers.
Thanks a lot. So we'll open the floor now. Please identify yourself and keep your question short. I see 1, 2, 3. So the lady here in the middle, please.
Thank you. Kim Dozier with Time Magazine. So a question, well, for anyone, but especially for Samir and Ferdine. China's aggression in Ladakh and other parts of the area, why? What do they get out of it? And also, do you think they will start funding insurgent groups inside India to make trouble? Or is the fall of Afghanistan and the rise of the Taliban going to distract them from that?
Thanks a lot. So Kaushar Hub from Atlantic Council. I think one can always count on Samir to wake up the crowd, so thanks, Samir. But I think leading on his point, especially on the technology side of stuff, it is important now to not only look at two standards on technology, particularly his point on political side of it. So for technology to be trusted, first has to meet the technology proficiency standard to do well what it's purports to do. But the second, perhaps more important, is the legal political apparatus that govern that technology. That's what makes it a trusted technology. So Huawei is not that Huawei is any good or worse than Ericsson in doing exactly the same 5G standards, but are the legal apparatus that makes. And I think that is an issue that we can collectively work towards the standards, and it just happens to be the theme of the Talent Digital Summit. So on trusted connectivity and trusted. The second part, just a question, sorry. One is that when I come here, and the theme has been for the last 2-3 days, I think very appropriately and in some ways very endearing, that my European colleagues are always sort of confused about where America is and where it is not. And I think a legitimate concern that they'll be there for us in NATO, and when Russia growls, it'll make sure you're there. When it comes to China issue, I want now to ask my European colleagues to explain themselves to a confused American. It's an issue of, we are caught between the two things. There is China, and then there is US, and we, the Europe, are caught in middle. It may work. I listen to your values. I listen to how concerned you are about vis-a-vis Russia. Then I hear this point about how we are going. And then we move to Indo-Pacific, and that's the Quad. So with my good European friends, as you talk about where you are and how close we are going to be with you, it'd be good to understand what your thinking on that is. Thank you very much.
Happy to oblige.
Teresa and, sorry, there were two people in the back. We'll have a second round, I hope. Someone, sorry, here in the middle.
Hello, Teresa Fallon at Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Thank you for this wonderful panel, and thank you, Samir, for snapping us all to attention. Just a couple of points here. Let's not forget that Huawei received EU Horizon 2020 funds. That was a clear choice by the EU. So European tax dollars went to Huawei to help them with their research. So I have a problem with that. I don't know about the rest of you Europeans. Second, Siemens has 20 research centers established in China. There are many other German companies who have invested in research in China. Why? Because China says you want to do business here, you have to invest in these research centers. So there's plenty of money sloshing around Europe. But where is it going? Is it going into Europe? No, it's going into China. These are choices that Europe is making. And tech regulation focus. I have sit through hours and hours of these tech regulation discussions as part of a panel in Brussels. You cannot regulate something that you have no expertise in, I'm afraid. And this is what's happening in Europe. You're going to strangle innovation. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll start, we'll have another round later. Dean, do you want to take a few of those questions that were addressed to you also?
Sure. I'm certainly not going to address will Europe be there for the United States. I will defer to the Europeans. But why China and Ladakh, China and Galwan, China and Pangsong Lake? What I would suggest is several things. One is that the Chinese have actually openly said about the importance of striking in the east while holding in the west. This is part of their military writings. So what we have seen is that, in a sense, this is an economy of force. Well, until very recently, there were no casualties. And even now, there has been no gunplay along the Sino-Indian border. But China has clearly signaled to India that it is prepared to engage in a variety of, frankly, land grabs. And it is gauging India's response. It is gauging the rest of the world's response. One of the fascinating things is, and this goes to technology, when the Chinese first crossed the Indian border back in 2013, there were a number of people who said, well, maybe they got lost. People get lost. It's not well marked up there. So I suspect that the Chinese were very deliberate in resupplying the units that got lost. Now, it's certainly possible that, looking at me, for example, I know I could get lost very easily. But when the truck drivers and the helicopter pilots show up with additional supplies, it's somewhat difficult to say, oh, they got lost too. And as important, and we see this throughout the eastern side of things, no Chinese officer of that party army was ever punished. Now think about that. Mm-hmm. If this was a mistake, if this was gross incompetency, you would expect heads to roll, perhaps literally. But that didn't happen. And instead, we have seen repeated subsequent incidents. And finally, I think that one of the other things is that this is underscoring to the Indian military, sadly, how the balance of de facto infrastructure lays. I had an opportunity once to talk to some senior Indian military officers, and they said that one of the most demoralizing things at times were meetings on the border, where Indian officers are riding up in jeeps after an arduous multi-hour drive up a rutted set of tracks, and their Chinese counterparts show up in lovely sedans, get out, an aide brushes off their coat because they drove up a 4-lane military-grade highway on their side of the border. That Indian officers, Indian observers regularly see air bases, military bases, logistics sites, railways. By the way, Xi Jinping recently did a visit to Tibet. And part of that, unprecedented, not in 20 years, part of that was to say, I run this place. Tibet is mine. And Tibet has the infrastructure. I'm not too worried. I can get up here and I will go back down. And I think all of that is a factor in signaling to India, you join a Quad, you join an anti-China coalition, whether with Europe or the United States, Australia and Japan, at your own peril. And I think Afghanistan will play into that strategic message that Samir said. Are you sure the Americans will be there for you? Maybe you shouldn't be.
Maybe a word on possible funding for insurgent groups.
I think that we are far more likely to see that in places like Nepal. And it won't be necessary funding for violent insurgent groups, but I think that the hybrid warfare model works in every democracy. And you don't have to fund violent insurgents. Pakistan is more than happy to do that, when you can instead create opposition groups, mass movements, et cetera, that simply, this goes to public opinion warfare, one of the 3 warfares of political warfare that the Chinese have written extensively about. There is a doctrine for this. Correct. And it works hand in hand with violence, but is distinct from violence.
Samir.
Very quickly on that same issue, I think Dean is right, but I think it's something far more urgent for the Chinese as well. Their recent incursions in Ladakh. I think you have to go back to Doklam. Now, whether you believe the Chinese side or the Indian side, I don't want you can read any part of any version of what happened. It was clear that in a third country, Indian troops confiscated certain equipment that belonged to Chinese construction companies. Now, I am not putting any spice over this. This is plain narration of fact. In the recent past, has anyone confiscated any Chinese equipment? They built an island in South China Sea. Were they challenged? They created fait accompli on the seas, and no one came in their way. Here you had an Indian brigade go down, dismantle their work, throw them out, and go back to their side of the border. Now, this for them is deep. This told them that there is a requirement to reset the relationship. There's a requirement to reset the power dynamics. Now, don't get me wrong. I think perhaps they have bitten more than they can chew. And I think Galwan is going to come back to haunt them. And, every few months they declare a new casualty. So by the time we get to the 100 years, they might have a much larger list of people who they lost. They did not expect the ferocity of the Indian response. I think they were stunned. They were stunned by the fact that here they were willing to hold the line. And I think this is not going away. I suspect we are going to see a decade of relentless Chinese pressure on the borders, keep testing us, and to see whether we can continue to hold a muscular posture to defend that red line that we have drawn. So I think this is an ongoing saga. Watch the space for more. On the funding insurgent groups, I started by saying they are gaming our democracy. You don't have to fund insurgent groups. You can create digital insurgency. I think the fifth generation warfare, the hybrid models that most countries today deploy, you don't require the American foundations to go and create the colored revolutions anymore. You can do it on Twitter and Facebook. Americans used to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, fund hundreds of organizations from human rights to scientific organizations which should go and create regime change. Chinese can do it by changing the search settings in your Android phone device. So I think the game has changed. They will certainly do that, and they are doing it. You come up with a certain article, and we as academics have noticed. We publish something, and we face a barrage for a week after that. We see how the public sphere is activated, how our old articles, irrelevant statements are all put out. It happens all the time. We are constantly facing a Chinese onslaught to try and shape the information space. And I think that's happening. And just to Kaushara's point, I think that's a very important point. Let's all be clear. All hegemony is bad, right? American hegemony, if we were to call it that, and Dean, I'm sorry I'm using this term. American hegemony had many features, but one very interesting aspect to it. If we did not like American tobacco laws, we could go and protest outside the White House. An Indian could go outside the White House, hold a banner and protest against American tobacco laws. We could also go and talk to their lawyers and their interest groups to partner with us in opposing American laws. America allowed what I have termed in some of my earlier work, penetrated democracy. While they were certainly the sole superpower, they allowed their democracies to be penetrated by outsiders who could participate in the decision-making process. They allowed their system to be receptive to the ideas that others may have, to the problems and grievances and challenges. I'm not saying they came up with the right decisions, but no government comes out with the right decision, right? And the new one has told us that we don't have to change a president to get the same decisions. So, but they allowed their democracy to be penetrated. Now, the Chinese, if you don't like a Chinese decision, tell me, where would you go? Which interest group would you work with? Where would you hold your banner and placard? Outside which monument and institution or office should you go and protest? So, techno-legal political system that you spoke about is precisely this, that one that excludes public interest, public expression, and public views is dangerous. And that is the challenge with the Chinese proposition. It is not because Huawei is good or bad vis-a-vis Ericsson or Nokia. It is because the underpinnings, the political, social underpinnings are non-transparent, opaque, and you cannot participate in the processes there.
So maybe precisely on this point, François, on the Huawei comment, how do you square being a systemic rival and a strategic partner?
I'll broaden the point because honestly, I think their relationship goes a little bit beyond the Huawei situation. Yes, the Chinese challenge has been present in the debate in the States since 2008, which was what Dean said earlier on. It only became a priority when Trump came to power, a priority as compared to fighting Daesh, for example. Macron in 2018 went to Washington, state visit, and proposed pretty much of his own bat, without too much consulting his European partners, but I think they would have agreed. Macron said, well, why don't we work together on China? And maybe you can stop trying to do a trade war against the European Union. Trump took this as a sign of weakness and said, go away, and did this on the television camera, brushing the non-existent dandruff off the shoulders of Macron in front of the White House. So the Americans discover that there's a Chinese priority in 2016. The Europeans discover that there's a Chinese priority 2 years later. So, you know, give us a break. China does historically and geographically have a somewhat greater interface with the US than it does with Europe. So a bit of patience with Europe. There are 4 conversations, adult conversations, which the Europeans and the Americans are going to have over the next few years. First one, which has begun, is the EU-US standards, norms, and so on, a discussion. Very, very important. Second discussion is about what do we do in the field of security, and notably the issue of, it won't be called that way because nobody remembers what it was, and those who remember it don't remember it necessarily very fondly, the COCOM issue. And there are a number of words about that in the 2030 report done by the wise men for NATO about a year ago. And some of my own ideas, which were published in Survival, made their way into that report. So the notion that there can be a transatlantic discussion on technology transfer and investment control, that conversation, I think, is pretty well prepared. The third one, which is going to be very difficult because it's essentially symbolic. So there's actually not very little in terms of practical interests in which you can trade, is, oh, do we all follow the democratic leader thing when Biden does his democracies conference? And the fourth one is the discussion about Indo-Pac, which is what you asked about, and quite rightly so. The Europeans have been working crabwise towards an Indo-Pac. You know, who started Indo-Pac? The Japanese and the Australians. Then in 2018, the French and the Americans adopted Indo-Pac. In 2020, the British also went Indo-Pac, and the Germans have just done so.
And the Dutch.
And the Dutch, absolutely. And I see that my Dutch friend here is smiling. And of course, the French, like the Brits, have been sending naval ships doing what the Americans would call phone ops in the South China Sea. Mm-hmm. There hasn't been a particular lack of this, and it's been very deliberate and it's been signaled and commented over the last 5-6 years. You know, when was the last time a Western warship drove through the Straits of Formosa, Straits of Taiwan, between the island and the continent? I think it was a French ship back in 2019. The Chinese did not like this. So this is a debate which is already beginning. But the Americans will also have to make up their minds. Mm-hmm. Will they prefer a burden-sharing approach or a risk-sharing approach? And this was already discussed in other settings during our deliberations. Burden sharing is very tempting. You know, you, the Europeans, you take care of Russia, and we, the Americans, will be able to focus on China. And if the Russians are too much of a problem, well, that's too bad for you, n'est-ce pas? Call it decoupling by another name. It's very neat. It sounds actually very rational, because of course our big problems are indeed with Russia in the field of defense and with a few other Mediterranean countries. But risk sharing, which means being in a limited but very real way alongside our American brothers in arms in East Asia and in particular in the South China Sea and running the same risks as the Americans, that's a very, very important decision to make. A number of European countries are ready to make that decision. I'm not sure the Americans are particularly interested when the Secretary of Defense went to Southeast Asia a few weeks ago, when he was put the question about burden sharing versus risk sharing. His answer was pretty much, well, you know, maybe the Europeans should focus a bit more on their own region. It wasn't very encouraging. So, you know, it takes two to tango, and on this one, we're going to have to learn the dance steps.
Maybe just one point, there will be an EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific that will be released in 10 days' time, actually.
What we call a strategy.
You
know, don't raise our expectations too much.
And we will publish a paper at ECFR on it, actually, in a few days, too. Ulrike, do you want to say a word on standards of tech?
And on other things. So crucial points just there by François on burden sharing and risk sharing, I think, on the defense realm. But I wanted to react to two things. First of all, Teresa Fallon's point. And sorry, I couldn't find out where you were sitting. If you could, excellent, because I couldn't, so that I speak in the right direction. So you said you cannot, so the EU cannot regulate what you have no expertise in. And I don't think that that's really the problem. I think what Europe is trying to do is we're trying to regulate what we are not building. And that is not ideal, but it is possible. So basically the way I would address this is saying, don't, you know, get rid of the regulation part. I think that's right, but it would be better if you were also building these things, and this comes back to the capabilities that we just talked about. So I don't think that it's an issue of, you know, Europe not having the expertise, but if you're not leading in a technology, if you try to regulate it, it just becomes much harder. I don't think it's impossible, quite honestly, and so this is why I would not say just abandon it and do something else. I think this is the right way, but it is much easier if you're also, you know, at least part of those producing it. And then a point about the kind of Europe caught in the middle problem. And I understand, you know, that for an American this may be slightly annoying or even very much annoying. But I think there are kind of two realities that we need to acknowledge in this discussion. And the first is that it's just not that obvious to European populations, I would add, that a world dominated by China, or let's say a world in which China is becoming a more important actor and the US is kind of declining relatively, is necessarily so much worse than what we currently have. And I'm happy to kind of disagree on that. I'm just saying that while for the US, it is very obvious, like you're the one superpower. If there's another superpower rising, of course you want to stop them. Like that's a very obvious equation. The situation for Europe is just slightly different. And I think we just need to acknowledge that for the European populations, there's a real question like, okay, I can see that no, it's better to have a world dominated by the US, and this has served us well, but like how much worse would it be with China, and how, you know, would people be willing to fight and die for it? And yeah, again, this is just a reality that we need to acknowledge. And the second reality that we need to acknowledge on that is that there are economic dependencies, especially kind of big European companies that already now make like 50% or 30% of their sales in China, and that influences politics, and we may deploy this, but I think that's the reality. So will Europe be there for the US? I'd say yes, but it will not and it should not just completely follow the US on everything here. I mean, I actually come from the kind of defense and military realm, so I'm more than aware how dependent Europe is on the US in the defense and military realm. So this is one of the reasons why I would say, like, yeah, definitely we should stick up for the Americans because it's also in our vital interest. But the points I wanted to make and why I kind of focused on these elements where there are disagreements between Europe and the US is that, yeah, it's not going to be a complete following, and just because the U.S. says, you know, China is now the new enemy number one, we all need to band together. I don't think that the Europeans will, or indeed should, just kind of rally behind and say, yes, okay, let's do this. It's going to be more nuanced, and there is a lot of talk about being caught in the middle. And again, I understand that this is probably annoying from a U.S. point of view, but here we are. That's why these panels are so much fun.
Thank you so much.
Can I make a quick point? I think, sorry.
Sure.
I think, I was just thinking that if we were to take a public opinion survey in Europe of young folks or technology users and give them two images, Xi Jinping and Mark Zuckerberg, who would they choose? Because in some sense, this is what the debate is about. That you can hate Mark Zuckerberg, and you can dislike his approach to technology and cannibalization of data, and you can regulate him, and you can actually do what you did to Standard Oil, to Facebook and other companies as well. Governments can intervene, governments can interfere, governments can act and change the nature of what the offering of Mark Zuckerberg is. But you can't do that to Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
So I think it is a false question that is being posed to the public. I think this is absolutely what keeps us from acting together. We can fix what is wrong within democratic liberal systems. We can't fix what has been ordained by Emperor Xi Jinping. And I think if you're going to say it is not too much more bad than what the Americans offer, I think we lose the debate there. What Americans offer can be fixed. That is how democracies evolve. You can fix it. And I think that is something that we need to bring into, and thank you for saying that.
Then we also need to fix it.
And thank you for saying this, because it is not your view. And I generally agree with you that Europeans generally see this, that actually is the Chinese proposition worse off than the American proposition, and no one explains it.
Sorry, let's take maybe 2 more questions because we have very little time left. There were 2 questions. Yeah, here, sorry, yes. And in the back, yeah.
I'm Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. I mean, China is clearly a very big issue, but I do slightly worry that this evening's discussion has made the Chinese 10 feet tall or 3 meters tall, whatever the appropriate equivalent is. I mean, there are weaknesses in the Chinese system as well. At the moment, it seems to me that Xi Jinping is probably giving the message to young entrepreneurs that you would be very unwise to try quite as hard as the previous generation have, because you're likely to get cut down to size rather severely. There's the demographic issue, which is well known. There are the environmental issues, which are also well known. I mean, I think there are obviously a lot of threats that we have to deal with and think about ways to deal with, but do we think sufficiently about the weaknesses of China and the ways in which we can make use of those, or the ways in which they actually threaten the long-term prospects for continued Chinese growth?
And in the back, yeah.
Thank you very much. Mark Lantane, University of Tromsø. I've really been enjoying the discussion about technology and technological competition, but another area which has appeared very recently has been discussion about China making great strides in the area of central bank digital currency, the so-called ECNY. There's been quite a bit of talk about whether this could be a challenge to the dollar somewhere down the line, or at the very least, whether it would provide China with a great deal of shelter from potential future, let's say, Western financial pressure. And getting back to the issue of standards, if we are going to be talking about first mover advantage, China might be in a position to really kind of dominate the field when it comes to emerging areas of fintech, should this be successful. And obviously, the jury is still out on that. So I'm very curious to hear about that particular aspect of standards and this area of digital competition. Thank you.
So do you want to start?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to pick on this last question. The United States has been relying and over-relying so heavily on punitive sanctions banking constraints and so on. I think of FATCA. You know, anybody who tries to open a new banking account nowadays has a much rougher time because he sort of has to prove to the bank that there won't be any problems with the Americans. And this filters down even to the household level. So yes, the Chinese are working very, very hard, as the Russians are, to de-dollarize and to, in the case of the Chinese, to make great strides in fintech more generally. And in Europe's interest is naturally that the same should happen with the euro, and that our banks should no longer be quite as subject to American regulations as they are today, where the most important department in most banks nowadays is the compliance department. So to make sure that we're complying with American legislation. Is the American interest the same as the European one in this field? No, it isn't. Our interest is actually much closer to that of China. And this is where the United States has to have these discussions, these adult discussions I was referring to earlier on, with the European Union and the member states in the field of defense and security. If without those discussions, things are going to go very bad. Because once again, the tools which the US tends to emphasize are tools which hit us at the same time that they hit China. That's a bit of a problem. Ian Bond's question. Yes, Chinese weaknesses, of course, we haven't been emphasizing them because we're trying to talk about how to meet the Chinese challenge, and you have to describe the challenge. But for example, Chinese dependency on custom semiconductors is well known. The Chinese talk about it all the time, and for good reason. It costs the Chinese more to buy semiconductors than it does for them to buy energy. This is quite impressive. And the European Union, of course, is part of the picture. I turn once again to my Dutch friend. The Europeans, a Dutch company, has a world monopoly on a certain aspect of design of software for the conception of custom semiconductors. The Chinese have been leaning very hard on the Netherlands to force the Netherlands to sell to China these technologies. So, you know, we'd better coordinate between the Europeans and the Americans before somebody does something really stupid, and knowing that also in the past, and Huawei was mentioned earlier on, very stupid things have happened. So yes, of course, we should look at the weaknesses and exploit them, and they're very real.
No, I think I agree with the idea proposed from behind there, that we should right-size the Chinese threat, because otherwise action and response becomes difficult. I think we have underestimated the challenge till now. I think the right size right now is to actually sketch out the dimensions of the challenge, which we haven't done. But it doesn't mean that they are the only game in town. Sure. And I think the game needs to be joined. Many of us were sitting on a tea break while they were playing the field. I think it's time to go back. The future, and let me just close with this comment. I think we are going to read the climate and technology is going to redraw the geopolitical map of the world. There'll be a new Malacca, there'll be a new Suez, there will be new South China Sea, there'll be new the Gulf, where energy and oil was produced in the last century. We will have new formations, new politics, new partnerships, new alliances. Technology is going to do all of this in the next 20 years. And we have to be nimble and fast enough as others to ensure that we have presence and we have stakes and we have partners in all these new geographies, in all these new domains, in all these new sectors that emerge. I don't think we've been doing that because we have still, all of us sitting here, all of us, our single most important partner very soon, if not already, is China. We have to think about partnerships beyond China if we need to right-size the Chinese challenge. Otherwise, we will always see them as an overwhelming benefit or overwhelming downside. We need to right-size China by having, by creating resilience and diversity and diversification in our interests.
Dean?
So, 3 very quick points. The first is the fascinating aspect that these 2 questions are actually linked. Because one of the things that characterizes the crackdown on Chinese entrepreneurs has been how many of them were ultimately related back to fintech. And in fact, what happened with the Ant-IPO, what has happened with Jack Ma is in part that Ma reflected a non-central party role in creating financial technology that would benefit the average Chinese consumer, which feeds into part two, that some of this, I would submit, is actually very limited temporally. The 20th Party Congress, which will occur in 2022, is when Xi Jinping is going to basically codify his continuation as both president and party secretary. There's going to be a lot of politics going on. One of the things that he does not need is unpredictability. The unpredictability of what someone like a Jack Ma or other Chinese wealthy entrepreneur might say or do. There is a real Chinese saying, not one from a fortune cookie, kill the chicken, scare the monkey. When Xi Jinping, in effect, killed Jack Ma, he's still alive, don't worry, he sent a message to every other Chinese entrepreneur and wealthy person. Don't stick your head up, because it'll get cut off. That being said, we also need to recognize that just as there are weaknesses, sometimes those weaknesses, in our view, the Western view, is not necessarily a weakness from the perspective of the CCP. Demographics is a good example. China is aging. China is likely to become old before it becomes rich. This is bad, right? The CCP's perspective, according to a good friend of mine, is, you know what old people don't do?
Protest.
Correct. They don't riot. They don't protest. So an aging population is one that we can maintain better control over moving forward. So that's a rather, so is that ultimately going to be true? I think time alone will tell. But it's an interesting perspective that maybe what we think of as weaknesses are not necessarily seen by them as such, and conversely, what we think of as strengths are not always seen as such either.
Rike, do you want?
No, I yield my time and look forward to dinner.
So I will. Thank you.
That gets the clap.
Yeah, we're done.
And sorry for being me.